of catastrophe are ultimately consumed by theological tropes. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who are into this now. Zizek certainly is one of them. In the face of this tragic predicament, of this ever-present arche of unraveling, every one of my actions bears the fullest meaning, even the minutest, the most trivial action. Every action pertains to something incalculable, and as such may be the last action, the one that grants final necessity and final meaning to my entire life, the one action that ends my life, the one that gives or ends life for someone else, the one that interrupts all that is given, the one that traverses or reverses all ends. Such tragic condition entails an irredeemable sadness. We speak of Achilles' wrath in the Iliad, but it's his sadness that's sublime. A sadness whose presence persists beneath the greatest and most genuine happiness, even before the moment of real openness to the other. This sadness is not caused by anything external, nor is it resolvable by things external. Thus, it is never an obstacle to love, pleasure, or good humor, to the laughter that the jouissance of mere existence induces unannounced. Now, the kind of language I'm using generates commonplace misunderstandings. Invocation of the tragic produces assumptions of a dark and generous existence. Nothing could be more contrary. A tragic existence is foremost reliant on a humorous relation to life's adventures, an ironic reception of the abyssal elements of what it means to be, to live, and to die without meaning, except for whatever meaning each one of us poetically conjures out of what seems to be nothing, but is the groundless non-meaning of things as such. What in modernist literature was termed the absurdity of existence emerged consistently when and where transcendental repositories of safety had vanished. Whatever the reason, that would be another discussion. It is curious that many people recognize Samuel Beckett being brilliantly tragic in the deepest and most exhilarating moments of his comedic humor. Yet in invoking images of the tragic in real life, they instantly turn somber and morose as if they had just violated some ceremonial savoir-faire. My sense is that discourses and practices of belief, including the atheism of belief, denigrate the horizon of decision. Contrary to what seems to be the case, namely that believers, by virtue of having conviction, are more steadfast in acting out of conviction, we say, acting on our beliefs, etc. The conditions of belief make all decisions predicate to an originary and binding decision, the decision to believe. The decisions of believers are mere reproductions of decision. That's why they come so easy, if that's what steadfastness is assumed to mean. Now, I'm mocking this assumption, obviously. The textual legacy of the trials and tribulations of belief are legion. But this alleged steadfastness of the believer's decision is a delusion, because if decision is to mean anything politically, it must bear the full impact of what Walter Benjamin named interruption. Let us remember that Benjamin's dialectical mind demands that we understand this interruption not to occur merely in the external realm, the handbrake that stops history's runaway train, according to the famous metaphor, but internally as well. Every decision is an interruption of the self, an interruption of the given parameters of being. Now, in contrast, I would argue that the performance of atheism, which produces the condition of permanent disbelief, raises the stakes on the exigency of decision. I mark disbelief in the full range of signification, the condition of being in awe before the world, the experience of wonder, the pleasure of discovering that there's always more to discover. Disbelief deconstructs both belief and unbelief, as well as their intrinsic, mutually affirming tension. I opt for disbelief here in the same way that I opt for wonder over miracle. In Greek, the word is the same, thavma. In Erasmian, it would be, I guess, what tauma, but pardon me again, as I said last time, on my Greek pronunciation. but with two radically different meanings before and after the advent of Christianity. The notion of miracle, rendered in New Testament Greek as thavma, definitively deprives us of the conscious practice of thavmazin, in Aristotle's language, a bona fide philosophical attitude drawn from the utmost origins of mythical thinking. And I'm quoting here what is in fact a famous quotation from Aristotle's Metaphysics. For it is owing to wonder, thavmazin, that human beings began and continue still to philosophize. And a man who is puzzled, and the word for puzzle is aporon, aporia, right? And a man who's puzzled and wondering, thavmazon, thinks himself ignorant, whence even the lover of myth is, in a sense, a lover of wisdom. Philomythos philosophos pos estin. For myth is composed of wonders. Ogar mythos singite ek thavmation. The wondrous element that myth articulates in Aristotle's phrase emerges from and never ceases to reside within a physis, in nature, in the Greek sense, no matter how extravagant or extraordinary a thavma might seem. Myth is how nature speaks, in a sense, and though there may still be something enchanting in mythical speech, the source of it remains immanent to the wondrous nature of the cosmos itself. This was the singular contribution of pre-Socratic naturalist philosophy, which placed all aspects of the divine or the supernatural within and not outside or above a natural cosmos that exists at the behest of its own law-making capacity, thereby excising thavma from its initial condition as, quote, the intellectual foundation of magic. This is a beautiful phrase by Gregory Vlastos, one of the great commentators of pre-Socratic philosophy. In contrast, what is subsequently recoded as miraculous is explicitly constituted to index whatever contravenes the nature of the cosmos. It is literally metaphysical, which is why its claimed physical appearance is so otherworldly, in fact, the epitome of the otherworldly. Of course, this doesn't stop people from investing in the reality of miracles, even when entrusted with positions of public responsibility. I remember a few years ago the remarkable comments made publicly by none other than a Supreme Court justice, albeit the court's most colorful personality. I'm talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Antonin Scalia, which were posted as instructions to the faithful as to how they can resist the malign disregard of the infidel multitude against the glorious reality of virgin birth. I quote from the Justice Scalia. It is not irrational to accept the testimony of eyewitnesses who had nothing to gain. He's talking about eyewitnesses to miracles. Huh? If I've brought any message to you today, it is this. Have the courage to have your wisdom regarded as stupidity. Be fools for Christ, and have the courage to suffer the contempt of the sophisticated world. Performing the conventional Orwellian doublespeak of the Bush era, Justice Scalia is unabashedly producing extraordinary syllogisms, like, it is irrational not to accept first-hand accounts of a miracle, objective accounts, or have the courage to have your wisdom, which is your objective knowledge of miracles, regarded as stupidity by those stupid enough to think themselves sophisticated. That's the logic. No need, I imagine, to elaborate on how another way of registering the meaning of sophisticated is to say worldly. From that standpoint, Scalia's enthusiastic exhortation to be fools for Christ, which is actually a phrase from Paul's Corinthians 1, is literally flaunting the idea, don't hesitate to be unworldly, or don't hesitate to subscribe to the truth, or even more, to the rationality of the otherworldly, miracles. Of course, the fact that all purveyors of doublespeak are caught in their own equivocal logic hardly registers when one espouses stupidity without question, especially when stupidity is coded as the way to reason. So the underlying significance of having made the miracle into a worldly category, the matter of disinterested observation, anyone can observe it, eyewitness testimony at a definitive point in history, and so on, is conspicuously denied. The double logic merely reverts to its other side. The miraculous is, after all, a self-sufficient category, The miraculous is both in and out of this world, exactly as are the Christian faithful, who can then act in this world in the name of the other world, even if only to wreak havoc on a global scale with the alibi of being ennobled and redeemed in some future apocalyptic moment that will settle all accounts in their favor. Scalia's audience may not know any better, but insofar as he represents the supreme institution of worldly law, the U.S. Supreme Court, his illogic is in fact a scandal. It is indicative of the scandalous otherworldliness of American politics today that Scalia's invocations of the reality of miracles do not register any scandal, just as George W. Bush's confession that God spoke directly in his ear did not trigger any alarm in the population that the president was routinely suffering from paranoid episodes. In earlier and more sophisticated times, as real philosophers keen to address the miracle in philosophical terms, both Spinoza and Hume agree, with different accounts as to its history, that the discourse of the miracle as the contravention of nature is quintessentially religious, having shifted from the signifying framework of magic in polytheism to the signifying framework of divine truth in monotheism. The historical advent of the Christian discourse of the miracle, insofar as it was articulated in the Greek language, thauma, obliterated the explicit association in the Greek imaginary between philosophy and myth, thereby inaugurating the desubjectification of one's wandering relation to a wondrous, astonishing, unpredictable world. As the category of the miracle is self-sufficient, one can only be the object of a miracle, what a miracle acts upon by its happening, one's affect as a result of an external effect. One cannot be the subject of the miracle unless one is God, and God is not a subject, at least in the sense of a living being acting and knowing itself acting in the course of time. In any case, and this is the point of Scalia advocating a militant stupidity, remember that's what he says, one is bedazzled and bereft before a miracle. Its experience is perfect heteronomy. The desire for a miracle is a desperate desire. In fact, the desire of desperation par excellence. We need a miracle to save us. On the contrary, the experience of thavmazin, of responding to the world with a sense of wonder, which is always linked to wondering, to questioning what is given, discredits miracles. Opposite to the effect of the miracle, the effect of wonder happens on your side, on the side of experiencing your making and your acting. You induce a sense of wonder in yourself because you remain attuned to the world's wondrous, astonishing fashion. The bliss of astonishment is Heidegger's phrase. You do not, however, produce the miraculous. The miraculous is revealed to you, generated somehow by an elsewhere, as an elsewhere. The miraculous is exceptional because it exempts you, it excludes you. This is why modern theories of miraculous exception, from Schmidt to Agamben and Badiou, are theological theories of exclusionary sovereignty, of heteronomy pure and simple. Regardless of what these theories claim for themselves, that in various ways they exemplify decisionist power, they are the exact opposite. They abrogate the capacity for decision by displacing decision to an undecidable beyond, to a land of miracles. Instead, the uncertainty of wonder, of disbelief, as opposed to the certainty of both belief and unbelief, keeps one exceedingly alert to the politics of decision, to the fact that decisions must be made always anew, not because they don't leave a trail or don't need to be consistently followed up, but precisely because their trail must be interrogated and their consistency tested with a sense of wondering. In this respect, and now I'm coming back to some of the things we talked about on Monday, I'm advocating a different sort of skepticism, not the condition that by means of interminable negation or constitutive undecidability leads to indecisionism, but on the contrary, the condition that by means of constitutive self-interrogation and radical uncertainty demands precise alertness to the parameters and forces of decision. This obviously presupposes that we learn to be comfortable, or at least unhesitant, with the extraordinary openness of horizon that uncertainty fosters, an openness that requires simultaneously both extremely focused consciousness of the present, as fleeting and ephemeral as it is necessary, and perhaps a kind of mad investment in the future, at least in the wager that makes a future be present, not endlessly deferred. I've often quoted Edward Said in this regard. It's a quotation I truly love. I quote, "All criticism is postulated and performed on the assumption that it is to have a future." Much as I've argued that Said's bequeathed lesson is for us to be at once skeptic and utopian. The presumed incompatibility between these two standpoints illustrates what I have been arguing here. The skeptic forces the utopian to be attentive to the present, to everything that passes before us in order to be judged. The utopian relieves the skeptic from the quicksand of self-absorption into the negative. This makes utopia entirely the work of the present, not the displaced projection to a deferred future, which is actually a gesture of nostalgia. And skepticism becomes the work of what cannot present itself with a certainty that it is not a mere phantasm. Of course, there's nothing prudent about this way of thinking. I'm coming now to my conclusion. There's nothing prudent about this way of thinking. In any case, prudence is irreparably tainted by a kind of Latin Christian meaning, which is why it is an inappropriate translation for Aristotelian phronesis, as it's usually translated. Phronesis is translated as prudence. In fact, I would propose that this sort of affirmative skepticism that I'm arguing is a productive way to rethink the notion of phronesis away from its restricted ethical Aristotelianism. If phronesis is considered as the practice of thinking on the edge of the given, of thavmazin, as he said, that is, exercising critical judgments without preconceived norms and injunctions in astonishment before the world, then it involves a great deal of risk, indeed danger. All transcendentalist ethics, and in societies that include or are products of a monotheistic imaginary, transcendentalism pretty much covers the ethical range. All transcendentalist ethics exist because they cannot handle the risk of phronesis, the risk of thinking and making a decision in the absence of a priori external norms. This is why I reiterate here my critique against the tendency, exemplified by Charles Taylor's The Secular Age and reproduced by many of its acolytes, to celebrate transcendence as resistance to closure. The presupposition of the transcendent as providing an opening is indefensible in and of itself. One may equally argue that the transcendental horizon is the epitome of closure. The presupposition of the transcendent as providing one may equally argue that the transcendental horizon is the epitome of closure, insofar as it is constituted on the requirement that the world and the worldly is enclosed in whatever lies beyond it. This beyond is precisely what closes off the infinite unfolding of the worldly. We can have all kinds of arguments about the limits of immanence and transcendence, but we cannot allow closure to be posited as the de facto opposition to transcendence, which thereby validates it. In the end, the point is not to be against transcendence and in favor of immanence, for immanence too may be codified as self-enclosed and thus indisputable domain. This would make immanence a transcendental domain too, in the precise sense that my friend Andreas Kalivas, political theorist, names the transcendental to be. That is to say, in his mind, whatever domain is taken out of the field of contention. Really like this definition of the transcendent. Whatever domain is taken out of the field of contention. To conclude, atheism is an existential position directed against both religious faith and transcendental reason equally. And it is based on a tragic view of life against which both morality and rationality, as unacknowledged derivatives of transcendentalism, are driven. But atheism is also a historical horizon, a specific social imaginary signification, instituted at the same time as theism, this religious imaginary in which divinity is an all-consuming but singular, all-signifying but figureless figure. For atheism to vanish, all theism must vanish. As of now, an unimagined social historical horizon. Perhaps such horizon could be thought to bear the most credible meaning of the post-secular, except that by then we will have done well to have invented another name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stathis. And in order to continue the conversation, I would like to invite Professor Nicholas Compridis from the University of Western Sydney to do a formal response to the paper. And after that, we can open the floor for question and answer. Nicholas.
Hi there. I want to thank Professor Griwis for another lively and sparkling paper. I'm probably going to give the impression tonight, the impression I gave Monday and probably will give on Friday, that I mostly disagree, and that is indeed the case. But I'm not, I don't have enough time to talk about what I like about what he's doing and wish I did. So it's more interesting to disagree in circumstances like this, but I just wanted to make note of my inability and failure to say something about the things that I like and what he's trying to do. So, in my first response to Professor Gururi's first lecture, I concentrated on his conception of critique and the irresolvable skeptical dilemmas which cripple such a conception both in theory and practice. I refer to this conception as belonging to an unmasking model of critique which has been dominant in the humanities at least since the 1980s, the practice of which, as I said, requires that anything and everything be subject to, be the potential object of, unmasking. Critique, in other words, practice as relentless dismantling, as ruthless interrogation. And my point was, and it's not mine alone, that once this model of critique makes itself an object of unmasking, it becomes riddled with skeptical paradoxes of self-reference, which are symptoms of logical and epistemological incoherence that reveal the extent to which critique in this sense has turned into a degenerating paradigm of critical inquiry. The term degenerating paradigm was introduced by the philosopher of science Imre Lakatos to explain what happens when a paradigm of inquiry is overwhelmed by anomalies that cannot be explained and dissolved from within the resources of that paradigm. So thinking of it as a degenerating paradigm would provide a different explanation of the crisis in literary theory that Professor Grigoris discussed in his first lecture, and I think would be apposite. In any case, critique need not be construed only as a practice of unmasking. It's not our only possibility, and I have proposed what I think is a more attractive alternative in my book, Critique and Disclosure. I'm still developing that alternative, and a new book that will be published by Columbia next year will present its latest iteration. Now, in addition to reworking the idea of secular criticism, Grigoris also introduced us to his vision of the tragic life, which is expanded and amplified in this second lecture and set in opposition to post-secular accommodations of religious outlooks and claims, though primarily in opposition to the metaphysics of Judeo-Christian monotheism. Although in discussion he indicated he doesn't like the language of the good and of hypergoods, despite being of Greek provenance, his tragic vision of life fits the definition of a hypergood without remainder. The vision of the tragic life he offers is not just a vision of the good life, the most worthy life for human beings. It is also used as a standard or standpoint for assessing competing visions of the good life. In this case, those that are open to the idea of transcendence, whether of a religious or non-religious kind. When a vision of the good life is used argumentatively as the basis for assessing other visions of the good life, as Gregorius does in his lectures, it turns into a hypergood. As Charles Taylor shows in his book Sources of the Self, a vision of the good becomes a hypergood when it is construed as, quote, incomparably more important than others and at the same time provides the standpoint from which other goods must be weighed, judged, decided about, close quote. Thus, Gregorius bases his atheism on a tragic view of life which is presented as superior to religious faith and transcendental reason and defended against both morality and rationality. To this hypergood, Gregorius ascribes the following properties: being prepared to live without a guarantee of meaning, in a state of permanent disbelief and radical uncertainty, open to wonder and the wondrous, and open